Hello, and welcome back to Degesch America Presents. I'm Ben Harrell, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk to you about the industry that I work in. On the last episode, we talked to Blake Buckner about choosing the right kind of equipment to have on hand for a wide variety of fumigations. Now, in today's episode, we'll discuss some of the safety considerations you'll need to address in preparation for your fumigation. And to help us out with today's topic, we've invited Aubrey Moore to join us on the podcast. Aubrey is the Director of Operations for Degesch Canada, the Canadian arm of the Degesch Group. So, please help me welcome Aubrey to the podcast. Aubrey, how are you doing this morning, buddy?
I'm doing really well, Ben. Nice to be on board here today, and glad you found a few moments to include me in the podcast.
Oh, no problem. I'm very much looking forward to talking to you. You're the first Canadian guest that we've had on the podcast, so I'm looking forward to getting some insight from our Canadian partners.
Well, I appreciate that. We'll try and do your little brother to the north proud here today. So,
all right. So, for those people who may not know who you are, I always like to start out by kind of giving everybody an opportunity to tell us a little bit about themselves. So, if you could just kind of fill us in on a little bit on who you are, that'd be terrific.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. My name is Aubrey Moore. I am Director of Operations for Degesch Canada. I have been in the fumigation industry, specifically focused on maritime fumigation, all things vessel fumigation for over 20 years now. Was the manager of Universal Fumigation Services on the West Coast during that time. And we were are the in-transit and quarantine methylbromide vessel fumigation team up here in Canada.
All right. Sounds good. So that's the one area of expertise that I have very little experience with. I've only done one ship fumigation in my entire career. You know, being a landlocked Midwest boy, you know, if you point to a grain bin, I can tell you I've probably fumigated it if it's within 100 miles of my home, but I've only been on one ship fumigation in my career. So I'm definitely glad to have your expertise on the call today. That's great. So today we're talking a little bit about, respiratory protection when it comes to fumigation, which is a really, really important topic because all of the fumigants are gaseous in nature that we work with. The primary mode of entry for us is through respiration. And so the respiratory protection, in my opinion, is the most important PPE or personal protective equipment that we need to have on the job site. We don't necessarily have to wear it all the time, but we certainly have to have it on the job site all the time. So I wanted to start out just by kind of asking you, what are some of the considerations that we need to be aware of from a respiratory perspective when we're working with fumigants?
Well, again, we have to be aware, like you said, Ben, I think you brought up a very good point that they are gaseous in nature, and we have to always be aware of the environment that we're working within. And if that environment is an unknown, for example, if we do not have the appropriate equipment with us to make sure we can measure the environment around us, and we should always make sure we have that respiratory protection in place and working. First of all, that's I would say that's number one for us. And I think making sure we have the appropriate respiratory protection given the chemical that we're using. And like all things, we hammer this home all the time: label, label, label. Be very familiar with what you're working with. Again, this goes for fumigators new to the industry. Also goes for those of us who are a little longer in the tooth. It's always good to refresh ourselves and to remind ourselves where the limits are. For example, the safe threshold limits that we can work within without respiratory protection, and where those limits change over to requiring something, whether it's a full face respirator or whether it's supplied air or SCBA. We just knowing what those parameters are and making sure that we're in an environment where we know if we need to use that respiratory protection and when we need to use that respiratory protection.
Yeah, I mean, it's really critical that we have the right respiratory protection on hand as well. I'm certainly glad that you said that because, depending on what fumigant you're working with, there are different respiratory protection requirements, and sometimes the equipment can be a little bit different. For example, if you're working with phosphine, there are phosphine full face mask and phosphine canister combinations that you can use. But for example, you can't do that with sulfurofluoride. Sulfurofluoride, if you hit a concentration that requires any kind of respiratory protection, you have to go right to the self-contained breathing apparatus or supplied air, the SCBA or the supplied air. There is no step up, so to speak, with sulfurofluoride. And then with methyl bromide, it gets a little tricky too. There are some canisters available or some respiratory protection available for methyl bromide, but there's also, at least in the United States, there's work zone requirements and all. It gets very complex. So I would just highly suggest to everybody, like you were mentioned earlier, label. The labels dictate every step that you need to take when it comes to respiratory protection. So depending on which fumigant you're using, just refer to that label over and over again. And another good thing, if you have a question, talk to the experts. Talk to a trusted fumigator that you know. Talk to the manufacturer of the fumigant. They are the ones that write the labels, so they'll tell you exactly what you need to know.
That's a good point. And again, you brought up an interesting point. And again, it's been something that I've appreciated having our scope expanded with becoming part of the Degesch family, is be aware of the differences in the federal laws between our two countries. So for example, I was referring to I haven't seen a brand new, perhaps the newest version of the methyl bromide label, but I was looking at the latest one that I have on hand here, and we do not have any provision for face masks and canisters in Canada. So for methyl bromide, for example, we're straight into, when using it, it's breathing apparatus, SCBA.
Right. And it gets tricky with the methyl bromide label here in the States too. It's not a common practice to use, a respirator and canister combination. But since we have a new label, I want to say the new methyl bromide label is maybe 5 years old now, or close to it. I'm not going to swear on that. I'd have to refer to it. I can't remember exactly how old it is, but I want to say it's around 5 years old. And it gets really complicated, the new label, because they talk a lot about work zone restrictions and the amount of time that you're in the work areas. So it gets complex. And that's why I always want to tell people, go back and refer to the labels. And if it gets a little complex and it's a little difficult to understand sometimes, talk to the manufacturer. That's what they're there for. Or talk to a trusted fumigator and they'll be able to help you out. There's plenty of information out there.
Exactly. And if as a new fumigator, make sure that whoever you're working for has the latest label available to them.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I can't tell you how many times I've been out on a job site and I've asked somebody for a copy of the label and I look at it and it's, I hate to admit it, but you look at it and it's 10, 15 years old and you're like, oh no, there's a new label, folks. Let's get that downloaded.
Correct.
It happens, unfortunately. And most of the time it's not too big of a deal. The labels usually don't change too drastically from iteration to iteration, but sometimes they do. Like I said, that new methyl bromide label, when I say new, like I said, it's about 5 years old, but the newest methyl bromide label, there were some drastic differences that transpired between the old one and the new one. So make sure you have the most up-to-date copy of the label. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about some of the considerations. What are some, and I guess we kind of mentioned this already, but what types of respiratory protection do you have to have on hand in order to make sure that you're being safe during the fumigation?
So again, like you said, it is fumigant specific, but for phosphine, for example, we always want to make sure that we have on hand full face respirator with a P100, an appropriate cartridge for the chemical we're using for phosphine. And in Canada, the regulations are very clear. If it's an unknown concentration, you have you have the mask with you and you have the SCBA standing by. If that concentration is from 0.1 parts per million to 5 parts per million, then we stick with the full face respirator with the appropriate canister. As soon as we cross that 5 parts per million threshold, we are into the SCBA. And important thing to remember too, and what we encourage all of our teams is, like you said, have it with you when you're working. So if you're out and you're doing your gas checks, having the mask sitting over in the truck is not the appropriate place for it if it turns out that you're going to need that mask right away. So always having ready access to the equipment that you need is crucial as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I couldn't agree more. You have to have it on hand and you have to be able to reach it as soon as that level goes above the threshold that your country dictates. And I thought it's kind of interesting hearing you talk about, in Canada, the concentrations where you can wear a full face mask with canister combination for phosphine, it being 0.1 to 5. In the United States, it's actually 0.3 to 15. So there again is one of those differences between our countries. It sounds like Canada's a little bit more restrictive than the United States when it comes to the concentrations that you can be subjected to for those different levels of respiratory protection.
Mm-hmm. The other thing, another consideration that I was having a discussion with a gentleman about this yesterday, actually, is it's very popular these days to have to carry some scruff on our chins or even have a beard, but we do have to remember that respirators, full face respirators, and SCBA for that matter, work at their very best when we have a complete seal with the mask to our faces. So as much as we might like having our beard, as much as we might like rocking a goatee or a 5 o'clock shadow, we do have to be very cognizant of the environment that we're working in, and making sure that fit test has been done, making sure that there is no barrier between. So we have skin to respirator contact, so a nice tight seal, and that is keeping us safe. One of the tenets that I strictly adhere to is there's nothing worse than having PPE that you believe is keeping you safe when in fact it is not.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point about that. Facial hair really can compromise your ability to utilize these masks quite a bit. And I've seen it over and over again. I've actually conducted fit testing on so many people in my career, and they walk in with facial hair, and you can pretty much tell right away, hey, I'm sorry, go grab a razor and shave because you're not going to pass this fit test. Sometimes they'll go do it. Sometimes they're like, I think I'll pass. I think I'll pass. And you test them, and almost every time they end up failing with the facial hair. I mean, it just happens. So you did mention fit testing, and I mentioned it just for a little bit. Just for those folks out there that may not know what we're talking about, what do you mean when you're talking about fit testing in relation to the respiratory equipment we use?
Yeah, so when we talk about a fit test is we're making sure that the respirator that we're wearing, the full face respirator or half respirator, if that's what you're using, or your SCBA, has a tight uniform seal between the rubber of the mask and the skin on your face. Again, what we're ensuring is that there is no leakage from the outside air other than the air that is coming in through the device itself. Again, the whole point of ensuring that we are protecting ourselves is we are working in a potentially dangerous environment with a fumigant gas. So we need to stop any means of that fumigant gas getting into our respiratory system. How do we do that? We wear the mask. How do we do that? We ensure that mask has a complete seal around our face and that there is no air other than the mask, the air that is being controlled through the respirator or supplied by the tank, getting into our respiratory system.
Yeah, I've worked with some companies in the past that require all their employees to go through fit testing on an annual basis. And what the fit testing is, there's typically two different types of fit testing you can do. There's quantitative and then there's qualitative. Depending on which one you're doing, it either works off of measuring the seal on your face with some pretty sensitive electronic equipment, or you can actually put a hood over the person's head and you can blow in a bitter tasting or a sweet tasting solution or do a smoke test to see if they indeed do have a proper seal around the mask. It's critical that this be done. And I love what you said earlier about how important it is to make sure that the PPE that we have on hand is functional, that it's in good condition, that it's working for the person that is there with the intention of using it. There's no worse feeling in the world than needing PPE, reaching into the box or whatever it is to grab it, and something's wrong with it. The connections are wrong. The SCBA air tank is empty. I mean, I've been on many jobs where I'll go right to the SCBA and I'll check it, and the tanks will be empty. And I'm like, hey, where's your full tank? Oh, we forgot to fill it. Well, let's not fumigate yet then. Let's go get this thing filled before we even put any kind of concentration of fumigant inside the structure, ship, whatever it is. We have to have this for emergency purposes. So you always want to make sure that you're checking your PPE before you put in any concentration of fumigant. You want to make sure it's working. And another thing that I usually do too, anytime that I ever ran fumigation crews, I would have my fumigators actually don or put on the PPE before we ever fumigated, just to make sure that we had a good fit, that it looked like it sealed properly, that the tanks were full, that the masks were in good shape, that we had brand new canisters, whatever the case is. check all of that before you ever fumigate, because the last thing that you want to do is get into that emergency situation and have PPE that doesn't fit, isn't right for the circumstances, has empty tanks, whatever the case is.
That's a very good point you bring up, Ben, and it's again crucial. You spoke at the beginning of the podcast about the importance of respiratory protection, and that it really is number one. It's the most important thing we can do to protect ourselves, as it is the primary mode of entry for the chemical. And again, it is so important that we ensure that, again, the fit test has been done, that we ensure that we have the right canisters on the masks for the chemical that we're using. And then, and yes, of course, for the SCBA, that we ensure that the tanks are full. We take it a step further. In Canada, we are required by law to provide 4 sets of breathing apparatus and 4 spare bottles to every ship that we fumigate as a extra to whatever they are carrying, whatever their complement is on board. And at that time, we will speak with the officers and the crew on board, advising them when to use it and to make sure that their kits are ready and standing by. And we have those SCBAs ready and standing by, making sure that the tanks are full, that the gaskets are intact, that everything is ready to go, again, before we commence any fumigation activities.
That's a great practice. I think that's a very, very good practice. You mentioned, checking the air concentrations to kind of dictate what type of respiratory protection that you need. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about personal hygiene monitoring, or monitoring the breathing zone of the workers. Could you kind of tell us a little bit about what personal hygiene monitoring is, and then just a little bit on what kind of equipment is available to conduct it?
Yeah, you bet. So again, personal hygiene monitoring is, again, actively monitoring the environment that is around you, making sure that you're aware of the concentration of the specific gas that you're using when you're in that environment. So again, and it is personal. So it's not, we're not looking for concentrations inside the structure we're fumigating. We're looking for what we are interacting with in real time. So again, what we're looking for is we're a couple different kinds of equipment we can use. We can obviously use, we have colorimetric tubes. So these tubes are tubes that we can use for a point in time measurement, and they will tell us what we have around us at the time. They are very precise. They do not have a lot of interference from other chemicals, which is very good. But again, they are slower. So it takes a minute or two to get that reading. So we default back to digital detectors. So, for example, I'm not sponsored, but a Draeger low-level detector, very good, very quick point in time. Or we can use a PID if we're using methyl bromide or a similar product, a photoionization detector. Also very good for giving you quick, on-the-spot measurements of the gas that you are fumigating with. Now, what we'll often do up here in the north is if we get a reading with a low level detector or with a PID, for example, is we will verify that reading with a colorimetric tube to make sure that reading is accurate.
Right. That's a good practice, actually. So, and I'm glad you mentioned the differences between those, because you have direct read devices and then you have continuous read devices. And so the colorimetric tubes are what we call direct read devices. And you're absolutely right. They kind of take a snapshot of a reading at that particular time. They're very accurate, very inexpensive. It's manual, so there's a hand pump involved with it. The only disadvantage to them is the fact that it does take that snapshot point in time reading. So once you've achieved that concentration, you literally, the very next second, the concentration you're being exposed to could change, and you're not going to know what that new concentration is unless you use another tube. And the tubes are disposable. They're cheap, but they're disposable. And that's where those continuing read devices can be so critical to use, because they're taking constant measurements of your breathing zone. So it's constant second by second readings. And it's a great idea to verify stuff with the tubes. And I love having the tubes on hand on every fumigation for backups in case something does go wrong with your primary continuous read device. But the continuous read devices for personal hygiene monitoring are really, that digital stuff, that's really going to be the best type of equipment I can suggest for that particular application.
Absolutely. Agreed. So again, for us, it's interesting working on the ships because there are some interactions with other chemicals, and that's where we find we use those colorimetric tubes. For example, in the engine room of a vessel, where we will always advise the chief engineer to not be conducting any hot work, any oxyacetylene work during the fumigation. Again, we hold these vessels in at the anchorage for 24 hours while we fumigate to monitor and ensure that the vessel is safe. And what we have found over time is that the acetylene molecule is very similar to the phosphine molecule and can give us a false positive in the engine rooms. So when we come across that, then we'll bring in the colorimetric tube to ensure that that's either we do have a leak we should be aware of, or we have phosphine in the environment that we should be aware of, as opposed to just something else that is affecting the monitor, whether acetylene or a. Sometimes we'll find even with the wash detergents, the crew are doing their laundry, and because of the high phosphate content in the laundry detergent, it can give us a false positive on the digital detector as well. So yeah, always having colorimetric tubes is a great asset to ensure that you are accurately reading what you're finding in your environment.
That's an excellent practice too. I'm so happy that you mentioned that because you're absolutely right. There are competitive gases in environments. Sometimes propane from fork trucks that are propane driven. You talked about acetylene. There are sometimes gases in those environments that can compete or give you false positives on the continuous read equipment. Absolutely. So if you do get readings and you're in environments, and that's where experience kind of comes in too, or being able to either having the experience yourself or being able to rely on experienced fumigators to confirm things is so critical, because you're right. There are competing gases out there that can give you false positives. And that comes into play when it comes to personal hygiene. It also comes into play when you're aerating facilities as well. So if you have to aerate a facility, I know ships, typically you fumigate them and they go out, they go out in transit. But a lot of the facilities, especially in Midwest, we have to aerate them as well. And knowing that there may be competing gases out there, and you need to verify with colorimetric tubes whether or not you're having issues with that, man, that's so important. So what a great practice that you mentioned. I really like that. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other types of PPE that you think we need during a fumigation to keep ourselves safe?
Yeah, great question. Of course, all the normal things would apply in a fumigation, making sure we have our high vis, our hard hats, our work boots. But specific to fumigation itself, and again, there are some differences even with this. And it's funny because logic would dictate that yes, we want to make sure we always have heavy rubber gloves on and make sure we got big boots on and all these other things. But that's actually contrary to most of the practices we try to employ. So, for example, with methyl bromide or SF, that's the last thing you want to be doing is wearing non-breathable gloves or rubber boots that can trap that chemical inside and against your skin. So with phosphine, we just want to make sure we have loose-fitting clothes on, that we have long pants, socks, and shoes on, that we're wearing dry gloves, dry cotton gloves or other breathable material to make sure that any dust that gets trapped in there can escape fairly readily. What we're doing in Canada again with and I think it's in the States as well and in some places too, is we are wearing a Tyvek suit. So what the Tyvek suit does is just protect us from the dust that is there when we're opening up the flasks. And what that does, we've found over time, is that once we take off that Tyvek suit, it removes all of that dust that was on us, making sure that the clothes we have below that suit haven't been exposed to phosphine at all. So again, just one nice barrier of protection to keep that dust inside the canisters off of our clothing and off of our bodies.
Yeah, that's another great practice. And I've noticed more and more in the United States, a lot of people, when they're doing fumigations, wearing Tyvek suits. And the other benefit to that too is it keeps your clothes from getting too dirty. A lot of these environments that we work in, it's they're fairly dirty. So you have to crawl behind a lot of things and under things to get things sealed up. And so it's nice to be able to keep your clothes a little clean wearing those Tyvek suits. So that's an added benefit to it.
Absolutely.
One thing that I always think about when I think about safety on these fumigations that we do is I think a lot about like slips, trips, and falls. And I think especially I would imagine on ships, even though I don't have a lot of experience, I would imagine ship decks can get kind of wet, being right there by the water. So I would imagine, the ladders, the ship decks, things like that. So I think it's a really good practice to make sure that you're looking at all of your normal standard everyday PPE, inspecting it, making sure that the tread on your work boots is still enough to keep slipping down to a minimum, making sure that your hard hat is in good condition, that it's seated properly on your head, making sure that your safety glasses, you can still see through them. I've been on a lot of job sites where I've looked at people and, their safety glasses are so scratched up that I can't imagine that they can even see out of them very well. And I ask them, hey, why don't you change your safety glasses out? Oh, yeah, I guess I should probably do that. Well, yeah, we have plenty. I'd rather you be able to see on the job site than than save, a few dollars on a pair of safety glasses. Yeah, let's get them swapped out for you, buddy. So
Well, you bring up a very good point, Ben, and it's something that, again, once you get a little longer in the tooth, you seem to not say, but I don't want to say we don't take quite so seriously, but you're not in quite so much awe sometimes when you walk onto a vessel. And I've experienced it recently. We brought some newer hires out, and you forget how industrial of an environment that we work in, whether it's inland fumigation or it's on a ship. And ship steel is unforgiving, and you bring up some very good points. I mean, always being aware of the environment you're in, making sure that you have 3 points of contact when you're climbing ladders or climbing steep stairwells, anything like that, making sure the boots you have are, the grip on the bottom is skid resistant. You brought up being wet and slippery. This is very true, but also some of the products that we're loading. If you look at soybeans, not so much, peas to a certain degree, canola, for example, it's like walking around on ball bearings on the on the deck of a ship sometimes. So yes, making sure that the PPE you have just to protect your body physically is in good order. Also making sure that you, again, chin straps on your hard hat. So we have upgraded all of our hard hats now, so they are fall protected. So again, if you fall, you want to make sure that hard hat is still attached to you when you hit the ground, right? So again,
right.
a slip and fall I referred to there, and it's again, and visibility, of course, visibility is crucial at making sure that the safety glasses you have aren't scratched. And another point back to our respirators, take care of your equipment. A full face respirator is a great tool to have. It will protect us. But if we can't see the environment we're working in clearly, then the main piece of protection that we have is compromising us somewhere else. So again, making sure you protect that face screen. If that face screen gets damaged or gets scratched up where it's unsafe, please go to your supervisor and change it out for a new one.
Yes. And to add to that, I've seen a lot of fumigators, that have to wear prescription glasses. And I've seen these folks take their prescription glasses off to don the SCBA to make sure that they get a good fit, which in one way is good because they are protecting themselves from a respiratory perspective. But now they're planning to go in and they're planning on doing this job and they can't see anything because they're not wearing their prescription glasses. All of these SCBA masks, they all have the ability to have spectacle kits installed into them. And I cannot suggest enough, if you wear prescription glasses as a fumigator, go ahead and get the spectacle kit. I promise you, your company is going to be willing to pay for that if it means the difference between you going home safe at the end of each day or maybe making some kind of a mistake because you can't see what you're doing.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. And it sounds so simple to say it out loud, but it is crucial that you can navigate the environment that you're in, especially an industrial environment, and especially an industrial environment where you have fumigant gases present.
Yeah.
And again, it's common sense, but as we're well aware, that common sense can be uncommon sometimes.
Yeah. And another thing that a lot of folks don't think about too is, wearing an SCBA, you're adding dimensions to your body size. So going up and down ladders, going through manholes, getting into tight situations with an SCBA, it's going to become more difficult because you have that added mass on your back. And so just being aware of that and making sure that you're navigating through some of those tight spaces safely, it's really important. I've seen people come very close to being stuck in tight environments because they don't think about the fact that they have that added SCBA on their back when they're going through areas.
Correct. And you bring up a great point, Ben, and one thing that we try to employ here, don that equipment, wear that equipment, get used to that equipment when it's not a life or death situation, when it isn't crucial that you have it on. So again, get familiar with it. So you don't have to have the full face piece on. You can keep that in the box, but put the backpack on, make sure you got that tank on, start to learn what it feels like to have to navigate with that on in tight spaces, bending over, crawling over things. Again, going through manways or through small confined pipe passages, making sure that that there's a level of comfort that it's not completely foreign. So when you do have to put that on, it is familiar. You know what it feels like. It's not going to become a hindrance. It's just an added piece of safety equipment that you employ.
Yeah, and something that I've seen some fumigation companies do is actually hold drills where they actually have their employees don the SCBAs or don their respiratory equipment, and they'll kind of time them to a certain extent to make sure that everybody becomes comfortable with getting these on fast, because seconds matter. And if it takes you 5 minutes to put on an SCBA, that could literally mean the difference between life and death, especially if you're going to rescue somebody that's succumbed to the fumigant and you need to get in there and help them. Or if you're in the fumigant, if you can't get the SCBA on fast enough because you're out of practice with it, that could be really dangerous. I mean, there is a reason why you see firefighters go through all of these practices and all of these drills in full gear. They do it so they can become used to it, just as you said.
Exactly right. Exactly. And familiarize yourself with the specific brand of SCBA that you have. Again, how long does it normally take for that tank to run down? If you have the luxury of using the tank yourself, know how long. For example, I know that if I have an SCBA on, I can commence to get the aeration started on a Panamax on a 7-hold vessel with 1 tank of air. That's an important thing to know, because if you know you need more than 1 tank, then again, you make provision to have those extra tanks standing by where they're necessary. So again, if you have that luxury, know as much as you can about the devices that you're using for sure.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that made me think of something too that I've seen happen. Not just know the equipment, but you need to know the environment as well. Most of the tanks that we use are what we call 30-minute tanks, meaning that
Correct.
they have an average of 30 minutes of supplied air inside of them. But depending on the environment, it may not be a true 30 minutes. And depending on the body type, it may not be a true 30 minutes. If you have somebody that's larger in size and they have to go up 5 flights of stairs, that 30-minute take's probably only going to last about 15 minutes because they're heavier, they're breathing heavier, they're exerting more energy, and so they're going to run out of that supplied air much faster.
It's a very good point. And also, once you start wearing the breathing apparatus, if you're not familiar with it, yes, that can cause your respiration rates to increase as well. So making sure that, again, getting comfortable with it and the more you have it on, the more you familiarize yourself with it, that will help keep your respiration rate lower, which will allow you to have more air in that tank for longer.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I've ran into this situation. Heck, I ran into it just last year, actually. I put on a brand new or SCBA with a completely full 30-minute tank, went up 3 flights of stairs, and it was already whistling at me, telling me that I was about out. And I was like, wow, I didn't think I'd use that much gas just climbing up these stairs, but luckily in preparation for that, and it was an exterior stairwell we were walking up to begin aeration on a mill facility. So there wasn't like a huge amount of danger. So once we got up to the top and we measured the area, we were opening doors up along as we went. But what we had done in preparation is we had actually staged full cylinders of air in key areas where we knew that the respiratory protection wasn't going to be a concern, but we staged them in areas where we could get to them faster. So like I said, I went up to 3 flights of stairs. My SCBA started whistling, telling me that I was just about out of air, but luckily I had foresight. So we had actually staged some cylinders in an area where we knew that the chances of concentration was going to be nominal. And we were right. We were measuring it with our continuous read devices, and the readings were 0. So we knew that we could actually take the SCBA off in that safe area outside the building, swap tanks, put it back on, and then get back to work. So staging those SCBA tanks in key areas where you can actually swap them out without any kind of inhalation concern can be key as well. I've also seen facilities like mill facilities where folks will stage cylinders like on the roof prior to the fumigation, because they already know that they're going to have to go in and open up the facility for aeration, and they're going to burn 60% of their air just getting up to where they need to do the work. So instead of going all the way back down the stairs, which they wouldn't have time, they'll actually stage the cylinders outdoors, and it's the same kind of situation. So just think about that stuff when you're actually conducting fumigations. You want to think about a fumigation from the end backward. What am I going to need to do to aerate this safely? Where can I stage cylinders? Where can I stage things? Having maps to the areas, so in case you get lost or if you haven't been to that particular facility before, all of this stuff is going to be critical, and that's where that experience comes in.
Absolutely. Again, familiarizing yourself with the environment before you commence your fumigation activities is such an important part of the process. Again, and we can talk about that with fumigation management plans. That's what that's all about, is making sure that before you start anything, you've accounted for all these different variables. You know where the exits are, you know where the safe zones are, you know where the areas of concern are, where the pinch points are, that you've highlighted all of these, and you've taken the necessary steps ahead of time to ensure that you have either a safe way out, or you have assistance in the form of secondary tanks, like you mentioned, et cetera, making sure that at the entire time, and you, like you say, you reverse engineer that to make sure that the entire process from beginning to end will be safe.
Yeah, absolutely. So I only got a couple questions left for you, but so far we've pretty much talked about the fumigator safety. But I did want to ask you a little bit about bystander safety, which is equally important, because the last thing that we don't want our fumigators to be unsafe, but we definitely also don't want any kind of innocent bystanders to be in an area that's unsafe also. So what are some of the steps that you think we should follow to ensure that any bystanders remain safe?
For me, the most crucial step that we follow, Ben, is communication. So making sure that we've, and again, if we're looking at adjacent facilities, if we're talking about personnel, vessel personnel on a ship, that we've communicated with them, that we've spoken to them. We, on a vessel, for example, we will have 4 different safety meetings with the officers and crew on that ship to make sure that they understand completely what is going to happen. They understand when there's potential for danger, the times when there's potential for danger, the areas and spaces that are safe places, the areas and places that are areas of concern for us. So making sure that we communicate effectively with everybody around, with adjacent facilities, for example, and again, making sure that we minimize, through that communication, we minimize bystander interaction, first of all. Second of all, like we said, we spoke about I mentioned briefly the fumigation management plan, making sure that we are managing access to the facility that we're fumigating. So we have the appropriate barricades up, we have the appropriate buffer zones up, that we've communicated clearly to people around, whether it's verbally or whether it's just visually, somebody walking towards and they see danger signs and danger tape, things that'll ensure that they know this is an area that we should not be accessing. If is necessary, sometimes making sure we post a guard. So we have somebody posted out there if it's a high traffic area, where that guard will be there as a physical barrier, confirming with people that they must stay out of this zone that's being fumigated. And of course, a huge one for us is watch your weather, watch your forecast, make sure that you're aware of the prevailing winds when we start the aeration procedures. Do we know which way the wind is going to blow? So before we commence any of those activities, making sure we know what the prevailing winds are at the time, making sure if there's going to be a shift in the wind. So making sure that we've addressed the downwind areas to ensure that bystanders, first of all, ensure that the buffer zones are adequate, and then to ensure that the bystander safety will be maintained.
Those are all absolutely excellent points that we need to consider as fumigators every single time that we fumigate. So I'm certainly glad that you brought all those up. So I only have one last question for you. And I always ask a version of this question at the end of every episode. What advice would you give a new fumigator, somebody brand new on the job, about staying safe on a fumigation?
That is a great question. And first of all, I would say welcome aboard, because it's an exciting career. It's kept me highly involved and highly interested for over 20 years now. So I would say welcome aboard, first of all. But I would remind them always that at the end of the day, it's up to you to control your own environment. It's up to you to make sure that you're safe. If you're especially in this day and age where we have so many tools at our disposal, we have Google. So if you're a new fumigator, Google fumigation, look up the labels, if your boss says, hey, we're going to be going out on Saturday and fumigating a vessel or a silo or a tobacco plant with hydrogen phosphide, go home, Google hydrogen phosphide, look at the label, find out everything you can to make sure that you can keep yourself safe. Make sure you're familiar with the label. Make sure you're familiar with the PPE that you're going to need. Make sure you understand, make sure that the people you're working for are providing you the things that you need to keep yourself safe.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. I mean, I can't stress enough. I mean, we all have our own personal responsibility for safety. So I'm glad you actually mentioned it like that, because ultimately, the person that is the most responsible for your safety is you. So
Correct.
make sure that your company's providing you with all of the tools and all of the knowledge, and they should be. But it's
Hmm.
up to you as the fumigator to adhere to all of the policies, to adhere to the label, and then to actually use all of the PPE and use it correctly. So I'm certainly glad that you mentioned that.
Actually, and the other thing I would say is ask every question. We always hear that expression there. There are no dumb questions, and that is absolutely in this industry. That is absolutely true. Ask every question, regardless if you think it's silly or you think it's simple. Or can you remind? I won't bother asking them how to do the fit test. They showed me. I'm pretty sure I've got this right. Pretty sure I've got this right. Does not cut it in our line of work.
Yeah, you said that perfectly. Good enough is not a phrase that we want to use when we're working with chemicals like this. Absolutely.
Absolutely not. And if you are unsure in the least, please take 2 minutes to ask somebody and make sure that you have the right answer.
I could not agree more. And if you're not getting an answer you're comfortable with, ask somebody else.
Correct.
Unfortunately, there are some people in our industry that have learned shortcuts that probably shouldn't be done.
Hmm.
So if somebody provides you an answer that you don't like, ask somebody else. You can always go to the manufacturer and ask the manufacturer questions. They're always going to refer back to the label, and they're going to give you the answer that's going to keep you the most safe. And your organization should be able to do the same thing.
Absolutely. And again, in the prehistoric days when I started, we didn't have ready access to the labels. Were in an office somewhere, in a file somewhere. But again, in this day and age, we have access to all those things. So when you go for your interview, if you find out you've been hired as a fumigator, ask your boss or the senior person, what chemicals will we be using? Make a list of those things, and then go home and do a little bit of homework. We all have access to this information now, so at least you're walking in, so you know what the minimum requirements that should be provided to you by your employer. Make sure that, and again, if you ask somebody and they say, we do it this way because that's just the way we've done it, that is never a good answer. You need to have standard operating procedures. You need to know, you need a proper explanation as to why we do things the way we do things. Because this is the way we've done it is a warning sign for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, hey, that's all I have for you, Aubrey. Listen, buddy, I really appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule to sit down with me and to discuss this really, really important topic pertaining to fumigation.
Yeah, Ben, it was an absolute pleasure to join you today, and I appreciate you wanting to seek out the small amount of advice that I have to share.
All right. Thanks, Aubrey.
All right, Ben, thank you so much.
I want to thank Aubrey for helping us understand the many safety aspects of performing a fumigation. Please remember, our goal is always safety first. On the next episode of Degesch America Presents, we'll talk about some of the things you'll need to do on the actual application day to begin your successful fumigation. And remember, if you have a question you'd like for us to answer, feel free to email us at podcast@degeschamerica.com. You can also find us on our website at degeschamerica.com or on all of the main social media outlets. So, until next time, I'm Ben Harrell, and I hope you have a safe and terrific day.